the Economist Livability Index is broken. It doesn't really paint the picture that most reasonable people who look at the definition of the word livability would expect. And that's largely because it's missing one major component, and that's the cost of living. Everything from what it costs to buy diapers, to groceries, to housing. So I did what any good economist would do. I decided to fix it by looking at both the cost of mortgages and the purchasing power in the 10 most livable cities as ranked by The Economist. And I think that the findings will shock you. But before we get into it, we need to delve into the Economist Livability Index and the North American rankings and discuss exactly why certain cities are ranked higher than others. Because, like I said, the cost to live in these cities is not factored in. So if it's not about cost of living, then what exactly is The Economist looking at when they're ranking cities based on livability? And what you might be surprised to find is that the top 3 and 4 of the top 5 are actually in Canada. In fact, for those of you in the US, what you might find interesting to know is that there's not a single city in the US that ranks in the top 10 most livable cities in the world. The number 1 most livable city in the US is in fact Honolulu, coming in at, get this, number 25. But that being said, the difference between the number 1 ranked city in North America, Vancouver, and the number 10 ranked city in North America, Miami, is very minute. In fact, all of these cities range between 92 and 96 on the livability score, meaning they're pretty much statistical ties. Now, that being said, the Canadian cities rank higher primarily because of 2 things. 1 is access to free healthcare, and 2 is stability. And a lot of this has to do with gun control laws and the risk of terrorism. Now, that being said, there is an argument to be made that free healthcare isn't all it's cracked up to be. Think long wait lines and pretty much a headache to get anything done that you need to get done. And on top of that, the risk of terrorism and the added safety when it comes to gun control laws are pretty much negligible. So in reality, the top 10 most livable cities in North America are actually in a dead heat. In fact, if you look at the criteria for the Economist Livability Index, stability comes in at 25% of the weighting, culture and environment comes in at 25%, healthcare comes in at 20%, infrastructure and education come in at 20 and 10 respectively. So it is arguable that outside of stability and healthcare, pretty much every city in the top 10 of the livability ranking is pretty comparable from a culture, infrastructure, and education standpoint. However, as I pointed out in the introduction, there is a glaring omission from the list of criteria in the livability index, and that is the cost of living. And here's the thing, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the cost of living in places like Toronto and Vancouver are astronomically larger than they would be in a place like Atlanta. And the most obvious reason for that would be the cost of housing. So what I decided to do was see if I could find a standardized metric in both the US and Canada that could be used for housing costs. And I did some digging, but there were some problems with respect to finding standardized data. But I did end up stumbling across some interesting data from Numbeo. Specifically, their standardized mortgage as a percentage of income data. And what this data does is it takes the average monthly net income, so after taxes, and it compares it to what the monthly mortgage cost would be over 20 years on a property that is standardized for size. And what it ends up providing is an index for what the monthly mortgage cost would be. And I found this data to be staggering, because if you take a look at the average cost of a mortgage over 20 years, the rankings for the top 10 most livable cities in North America change drastically. In fact, Toronto and Vancouver, the number 1 and 3 ranked cities, moved to number 9 and 10. And what's even more interesting is that the number 6 most livable city in North America, Atlanta, moves to the number 1 spot based solely on the cost of having a mortgage. But the cost of housing isn't the only thing associated to living in a specific city. For example, a place like Honolulu is going to have high costs of food and high costs of transportation, primarily because it's on an island in the middle of the ocean. So I realized I had to dig a little bit deeper and look at the actual purchasing power in various cities. And what I found was that Numbeo had a really interesting data point for this as well, an index that rates purchasing power relative to one of the most expensive cities in North America to live in, New York City. So I decided to take that purchasing power index, which also includes cost of living, and decided to re-rank the whole list once again. And this time, I think our ranking got even better. But before I get into the results, I need to explain exactly how this purchasing power index works. New York, being the city that all the prices are indexed to, would be ranked 100. Any rankings underneath 100 indicate that there's less purchasing power, and any rankings over 100 indicate that there's more purchasing power. So a score of 90 would indicate that you have 10% less purchasing power, and a score of 110 would indicate that you have 10% more purchasing power. So when we re-rank the cities based on purchasing power, here's the results. Atlanta remained in first place, having both the lowest mortgage costs and the highest purchasing power, 21.5% more purchasing power than New York. Washington now came in at number 2. Pittsburgh came in at number 3. Seattle moved to position number 4. Calgary moved to the middle of the pack at number 5. Montreal moved to number 6. Toronto to 7. Miami to 8. Vancouver to 9. And Honolulu to 10. And this makes a ton of sense. Because let's be honest, we all know that it is exceedingly expensive to live in a place like Hawaii. So if you wanted to live in one of the top 10 most livable cities in North America, but you are also concerned about cost, places like Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Washington, and Seattle are obvious choices. Your dollar will just tend to go a lot further in those cities. And if you want to live in Canada, Calgary obviously becomes the number one choice. Don't hate me because I live in Calgary, that's just the way the numbers worked out. But it also becomes clear that Toronto and Vancouver are places that are very expensive to live. Even though they rank number 1 and number 3 on the Livability Index, do you really want to, or can you even live in a city that is exceedingly expensive? If you can't afford to live there, the livability ranking should be 0. Those cities are just simply not that livable. It doesn't matter what the Economist says. Now, at the end of the day, there's some issues with the data both from the Economist and from Numbeo. The obvious issues with the data from the Economist is that they omit cost of living, and some of the issues associated with the Numbeo data is that it is based on a single person and not family income, and they don't account for what the average mortgage size is, nor do they account for what the average down payment is in those cities. But what the Numbeo data does do, combined with the data from The Economist, is paints a completely different picture of what a livable city is. And I can tell you right now, places like Vancouver, Toronto, Honolulu, and Miami are not places that people are flocking to. They are simply unaffordable, and in fact, more people are leaving than are showing up. Oh, wait, did I just ruin the surprise? There's going to be another video on that somewhere down the road. Oh, and if you want to know more about what it means to be wealthy and how much money you would actually need to live in one of these cities, make sure you check out this video right here.